The fate of America's public lands is at a crossroads. With sweeping federal budget cuts, mass job losses at key agencies like the Department of the Interior and the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and a growing push for resource extraction under the banner of economic security, an already strained national parks and trails system is under even more pressure with looming uncertainty. At the heart of these rollbacks sits a potential deepening of extractive policies that prioritize industry over public good. In this episode, we sit down with Courtney Lyons-Garcia, who's the executive director of the nonprofit Partnership for the National Trails System. We unpack what these changes mean for the protection and stewardship of America's most treasured landscapes and the trails that tell the complicated histories of these lands. We'll explore how federal funding freezes are impacting nonprofit partners working on the ground and what that means for how we experience the outdoors in the U.S. But beyond the threats, we also discuss paths forward, how Indigenous stewardship efforts are reshaping storytelling and conservation, what policies we should be keeping a close watch on, and how everyday people can take action to safeguard public lands.
I'm Courtney Lyons-Garcia. I'm the executive director of the Partnership for the National Trails System. The National Trail System is 32 congressionally designated national trails. They're in every state in America, and we have both scenic and historic trails. And our organization convenes these organizations for training and advocacy, and we work with all of them on administration pieces, on fundraising, on promotion of the entirety of the National Trail System.
The National Trails System Act of 1968, as amended, created a framework for developing a national network of trails across the United States in both urban and rural areas. The act established 4 classes of trails: National Scenic Trails, National Historic Trails, National Recreation Trails, and Connecting or Side Trails. National Scenic Trails are long-distance routes through protected corridors, such as the Appalachian and Pacific Crest Trails, the first 2 that were designated under the Act. In contrast, National Historic Trails commemorate historically significant routes of Indigenous peoples, civil rights movements, migration, and settler activity. Historic trails range from 54 miles to more than 5,000. Today, the National Trails System includes 11 National Scenic Trails and 21 National Historic Trails. Administered by agencies such as the National Park Service, U.S. Forest Service, and Bureau of Land Management, the system encourages public access while preserving significant natural and historical resources. Despite the protections offered by the National Trails System, development remains one of the greatest threats to public lands beyond climate change. Expanding infrastructure, energy projects, and private land encroachment can fragment trail corridors, degrade ecosystems, and limit public access.
The number one threat, regardless of what administration is in, is development. We all see new subdivisions going up, buildings going up, these AI labs that take up so much water and our heat sinks. All these pressures that we see every day driving around our own cities are just as challenging for our public lands. So development, particularly for trail systems, is something that we should all be paying attention to. So the closer a development gets to a scenic trail, the more the view shed is degraded, the more noise there's going to be. And then also a lot of times, particularly for suburban development, they often don't plant plants that are good. So non-native plants will start to get out of control and they can creep in on the trail corridor or public lands. So development is a huge stressor for our national trail system. The other thing that's happening, national scenic trails are often federally owned. So like the Appalachian Trail, but our historic trails are trail corridors, but they are often owned by hundreds of landowners from A to Z. And so oftentimes There'll be a private landowner and they'll sell that to a new development on the El Camino Real de los Tejas National Historic Trail. They plowed under trail markers and didn't even realize that they were historic markers.
The El Camino Real de los Tejas National Historic Trail originated in Mexico City and stretches 2,580 miles, following paths once used by Indigenous peoples for trade. These routes were later vital trade corridors during Spanish conquests, leaving behind subtle landscape features such as swales, shallow indentations formed over time by the repeated passage of wagon wheels. In 2022, however, a San Marcos developer destroyed one of these historic swales by installing a drainage pipe, permanently erasing a tangible trace of the route that was once there.
El Camino Real de los Tejas is a historic trail. It goes from the bottom of Texas, from the border, up through Louisiana, and it follows the old historic trail that the Spanish followed, but was also previously followed by natives. And it follows the water sources. It's a wonderful opportunity for people to see a historic trail. So we're losing historic and cultural assets. And sometimes we don't even know it until it's already done and gone. Outside of things like climate change, development pressures are massive against all of our federal lands, but in particular, our trail corridors are feeling that so much on a daily basis.
Any conversation about public lands must begin with an acknowledgement of the stolen land that makes up the arbitrary borders of what we refer to as America. Last June, Congress approved the Public Lands Rule, aiming to give land conservation equal priority alongside commercial activities and to encourage co-stewardship with tribal nations. Shortly after its passage, congressional Republicans introduced a bill to repeal it. Historic trails mark important moments in the history of this land and its people, passing through the traditional homelands of Indigenous communities. For example, the Trail of Tears National Historic Trail tells the harrowing story of forced removal of the Cherokee and other southeastern tribes. In 1838, under the authority of the Indian Removal Act of 1830, championed by President Andrew Jackson and a consequence of American expansionist policies and anti-Indian rhetoric, the U.S. government rounded up, imprisoned, forcibly removed, and displaced more than 16,000 Cherokee from their homelands in Tennessee, Alabama, North Carolina, and Georgia to what is present-day Oklahoma. Spanning approximately 2,200 miles and across 9 states, the forced, bitter march west was marked by profound suffering. Thousands died from cold, starvation, and disease. Today, the Trail of Tears is more than a historic route. It is a solemn reminder of loss, resistance, and survival. Native Lands National Trails is a mapping and research initiative that centers Indigenous perspectives in the stewardship and storytelling of the National Trails system, which spans over 89,000 miles across ancestral lands in the United States. The project was a collaboration between the Bureau of Land Management, Partnership for the National Trails System, Native Land Digital, an Indigenous-led nonprofit that specializes in mapping Indigenous territories, and Ancestral Lands Conservation Corps. While many trail maps have historically honored European settlers and excluded Indigenous territories, Native Lands National Trails offers an interactive tool that allows users to explore which tribal nations' lands they hike on, helping to reframe trails not just as recreational spaces, but also as cultural landscapes.
If you want to know the history of the land that you're going to be on, so say you want to go visit the Pony Express Trail outside of Tahoe, you can go on and look at the section of trail that you're going to be on and see its connection to the Indigenous community. And some of them have multiple Indigenous tribes, Native American tribes that have had different ties to that land. That was an effort that we made to ensure that people understood where they were and who that land was a part of and what that heritage is. Because I think it's important that people understand that this is ancient pathways. Most of these trails are following ancient trails that have been around for many, many, many years and through many generations. Many of these trails have been utilized for a very long time, and we should honor that and recognize that.
To understand the nuance of how national trails are managed, we must first understand that each national scenic or historic trail is designated for administration to one or two federal agencies by either the Secretary of the Interior or the Secretary of Agriculture, as designated by Congress. The three primary agencies are the Bureau of Land Management, National Park Service, and U.S. Forest Service. National Trail Management is more local and provides on-site jurisdiction for segments of scenic and historic trails. Therefore, various government and private entities own or manage lands along each national trail.
National trails, many of them, including scenic and historic, have sections that are not federally owned. So on long distance trails like Continental Divide or Arizona, there are often sections that are sometimes owned by a county, sometimes owned by the state, and sometimes owned by a city, and sometimes privately owned or owned by a nonprofit. For the Ice Age Trail, which is a scenic trail, they have a land protection program and volunteers that are watching all the time. Is land in the trail corridor being sold? And if they are, then they'll go out and work to either get an easement or purchase, and then they'll work with the Park Service to have that brought into the fold. And so that's the kind of thing that's happening all across the country. The nonprofits that work with our three land management agencies, they do a really great job of being aware of what's going on along the corridor and understanding who all the partners are. So there's a wide variety of partners across the country that work with trails, and they're great partners. So often, like in Florida and Texas, parts of the trail are managed by counties or city staff because the trail runs through, for example, a city park or a county park or municipally owned land. So that's happening all across the country for a lot of these trails. A lot of these trails are so long. They're thousands of miles. Or Country Scenic Trail, longest trail in the country. It goes all across the top of the country, and it's crossing through national forests and other rural lands. So it's just a network. It's a complete interconnected network of different types of protection.
A trail corridor refers to the designated area of land that encompasses and protects the trail and its surrounding environment. It includes not only the trail tread itself, the path where people walk, bike, or ride, but also the adjacent landscape that provides scenic, historical, ecological, or cultural value. Trail corridors are essential for preserving the integrity and continuity of trails, offering space for wildlife movement, safeguarding historic features, and ensuring a buffer from encroaching development. By maintaining these corridors, agencies and communities can protect both the physical trail and the broader experience it provides.
When a trail is designated by Congress, it's going to stretch from Houston to Austin, Iowa to New Hampshire, or whatever. They designate a route, and that's called the trail corridor. And that can move over time. For example, Appalachian Trail and Over Mountain Victory Trail and Florida Trail all got smashed by Hurricane Helene. And so parts of the Appalachian Trail may move a little bit this way or a little bit that way because it was washed out. There was part of a riverbank on the Over Mountain Victory Trail that was completely lost and cannot be rebuilt. It was just completely washed away. And so the trail border will have to move little bits here and there. But that is sort of the area of protection. That's the area that's maintained and monitored by the nonprofit groups that are contracted to do so, or the federal employees whose job it is. And that's where they do the cultural interpretation. That's where they're going to do the signage. That's where they're going to do all of their monitoring. And that's where they're, going to be responsible for safety.
According to the National Trails System Act, sections of a National Historic Trail located on non-federal land are only included in the trail system if the landowner voluntarily requests certification from the National Park Service. This certification involves a written agreement between the property owner or manager and the National Trails System, in which both parties commit to protecting the trail's resources and allowing some level of public access. The Bureau of Land Management covers around 235 million acres, nearly 1/10 of the country. Recent federal job cuts across the Department of the Interior and U.S. Department of Agriculture means the maintenance and care of public lands is under threat, not to mention the direct impact this will have on park visitors. Complicating matters further, a federal court recently ruled that the layoffs were unlawful and ordered agencies to rehire dismissed employees, leaving the future of maintenance in a bit of a limbo.
The job loss is extreme, and it's impacting frontline people. So these are not heavy salaried people. The amount of money that's being saved by the American taxpayers is what former NPS director John Jarvis called decimal dust in the federal budget. It's nothing. It's just nothing. But the loss is staggering. It'll be people who are issuing you your backcountry permit to go camping in the backcountry, or search and rescue. We lost search and rescue rangers. What is going to happen this summer when we have somebody who falls and has a terrible injury on a national trail in the backcountry, and there's no search and rescue person to go get them? A lot of the people that were lost were people who had training in wilderness emergency response. And so you take all these people out that have wide certifications and trainings across lots of disciplines. I mean, when you go work at a place like Big Bend National Park, which is the most remote of the lower 48 parks, and, I worked with Big Bend for 13 and a half years, and everybody in the park responds to an incident. If there's a fire, if there's a flood. We had people who work in the front office loading files and moving historic items and stuff when we had a flood, like every hand on deck. It's not just the firefighter that responds. And so when you take away all these people that have all this cross training, you're losing the ability to help people who are in trouble during an incident, and you're losing the opportunity for first responders to be at their best because they're going to be exhausted and have no support. So there's a real concern for the safety of visitors, particularly that come in these large numbers in the summer to understaffed parks. When you take a forest like Bridger Teton, which is near Jackson Hole, which is super popular in the summer for Teton and Yellowstone visitors, and they lost all or almost all of their red card holders. So that's everyone who's a backup in firefighting. That's a massive impact if they have a fire incident this summer. And then, the other things that you won't see, like who's going to be doing junior ranger programs? Kids love junior ranger program. And who's going to be doing those for them? Who's going to be, like I said, issuing those backcountry camping permits? Is there going to be an open restroom? I mean, these are really rural places. If the restrooms are closed, where are they going to use the restroom? It's just the basic 101 of having a safe place. So this is a zero benefit to the American people. A more risk-filled, trashed up family vacation is not what Americans want. This is not what the American public is asking for. Our public lands are economic generators. And so if you have tons of people going somewhere and they have a terrible time, they're not going to stay, they're not going to spend their money, and all of these trail towns and all of these hostels and family-owned hotels, family-owned restaurants, they're all going to lose out. The loss is just compounded. It's not just the fee dollar of the family going on vacation. It's all of the other spending that they do. And if they have a terrible time and they've been, waiting for years to do their big family park vacation and they do it this summer and it's a terrible experience, that's a loss for everyone.
Reframing the protection of national lands and funding that supports the national park and trail system as an economic generator is particularly important at a time when the current administration is pushing to privatize public lands for resource extraction. Narratives around economic security are increasingly being used to justify the intensified exploitation of natural resources. For instance, a recent executive order to expand American timber production calls for increased logging across the National Forest System and Bureau of Land Management, weakens Endangered Species Act safeguards to fast-track timber sales, and sets annual timber sale targets, measures that could lead to extensive clear-cutting across federal forests.
Research shows that the timber's a loss leader. There's not a lot of money made off of that. So there's really no argument to do it, and the research shows, again, that thinning can actually make forest fires worse because when forests grow up together, there's a moisture content that's within there. There's shade. When you start to thin that out, then you're drier and hotter. So then you have hotter fires that move faster. And so it isn't helpful economically to do that. It doesn't make a lot of money. And that, to me, is the shame in all this, is that it's like they're concentrating on the wrong thing. If you want to make money off public lands, and that's what you think your mandate is from the American public to do, there's another way to do it that isn't extractive. You can focus on the $1.1 trillion outdoor recreation industry and things like our Bureau of Land Management lands and forest lands where you can ride horseback and canoe and do all sorts of really fun things. One of the best parts about our public lands is they are within reach for so many Americans. I'm going to Disneyland with my daughter at the end of this week, and there's nothing wrong with that. But people want a different experience from their public lands. They want that kind of outdoor, gritty, fun experience where you see a bald eagle or you see a bear. Like, our public lands are a really affordable way for families to do that. Camping in a forest is not super expensive. And so it gets more people out of doors. It gets more people on their shared resource and on their shared public land. And so I feel like it's a missed opportunity. There is a lot of money to be made. It's a $1.1 trillion industry right now. It dwarfs the extraction industry in huge ways. And it also provides 7.6 million jobs. So the best part of this secret is this is money being made in America that stays in America. This is the best thing we can do for our economy and for our citizenry, is to promote this outdoor industry and this recreation economy. And then also brings in tourists from out of the country that come in and spend money. 10% of the people that are doing hikes in the summer on our long distance hikes are out of the country. And so that's money that's coming in from out. We can do all of the things and not hurt our land in the process.
Many national trails rely on partnerships with local nonprofit organizations for maintenance and support. Sections of trails like the Pacific Crest Trail and the Appalachian Trail pass through mountainous areas managed by the U.S. Forest Service. But with federal funding currently frozen and legal challenges, organizations may struggle to safeguard these trails from natural disasters.
The National Trail System actually calls for partnerships. It's in the congressional legislation. So it's required. 70% of the trail work on national trails is done by a nonprofit partner. And so 70% of the work's not getting done this summer. That means that trails that were washed out from fire or flood and need to be rerouted are not being rerouted. Trees that fell across are not being cut down and moved. And so, 70% is a huge number. That's a big, big loss. Pacific Crest Trail is not doing 52 weeks worth of work because their funding was frozen and they don't have the money to just outlay it, without any guarantee of being refunded. So they're not hiring conservation crews. And again, the trickle-down impact is not only are they not hiring the crews and the work is not getting done, that's young Americans who are not being employed and have to look elsewhere for jobs. So it's like a vicious cycle. Some of our nonprofits are having to scale way back, way back, and they're going to lose staff. When you don't have access, then your search and rescue and your fire people, they use the trails to get to incidents. So the danger of everything just vaults way up. So the danger to the visiting and using public is just overly extreme, and the danger to frontline people, I can't emphasize that enough. They keep telling us, the firefighters are still employed. Well, yes, but firefighters are not the only one that fight a fire, and they have to be able to get to the fire to fight it. So it's just this vicious cycle of loss of access, loss of safety, and loss of jobs.
With so much noise in the news about dangerous policy changes and federal cuts, it can be easy to lose sight of issues that do not make their way into the headlines, which is why I asked Courtney what she believes we should be keeping a close watch on.
I think something that we need to watch really closely, at least in the trails world, is inventory, assessment, and monitoring. It's just, one of those sort of dry terms, but what it does is it helps define the trail corridor and the assets that are inside it, including cultural, natural, all of the resources. And if that's not properly done, and the purposes and use of the land are not properly identified, then they can kind of go in and do whatever they want with the land, right? So we need to do inventory assessment monitoring properly on all of our national trails so that we can have that trail corridor established and in writing, so that when they are wanting to put a wind turbine here or drill there or whatever they want to do, they have to go through these hoops and analyses and think about maybe rerouting, or instead of rerouting, maybe shifting where something is done. So we have a lot of worry about the protection of trail corridors. If the people that are fired were working on inventory assessment and monitoring, or if the contracts that they have with contractors like Logan Simpson are not renewed, then you are losing out on this piece of protection that's a legal protection for our trail corridors. And so we are concerned for any of the staff that are lost that do the monitoring, that are counting species, monitoring for invasives. That is a loss that will be hard to be replaced. And you can't rely on volunteers to do all this work. Volunteers are meant to be the icing on the cake, not the cake. What I hope, though, what I truly hope, is that this spurs supporters to jump in with us to do the work. You can create buffers for the trail corridor. You could protect all the land outside the trail corridor, right, without the federal government's help. If there's a piece of land that's right next to the North Country Scenic Trail, you can go out and buy that land, right? You don't have to ask anyone's permission to buy private land, right? So we can be protecting through purchase of buffers, conservation easements. We can do all this without the Department of Interior or USDA. I talked earlier about how a lot of our historic trail corridors are on public lands that are more locally owned by city, state examples. So we can work with them to do trail easements, to do conservation easements, to do protection, to create parks along those stretches, to create trail networks along those stretches. Communities across the country are incredibly supportive of the trails in their community. They love them. They are so eager to put up signage, to welcome people, to describe the history of their area, to do all of the things. And so we can work directly with all of these communities, but we need funders, we need communities, we need people to step forward and say, I want to do this work. I want to jump in. I want to protect. And we can work with them to do that. We can pair them with local partners, or we can do the work ourselves. But now's the time to act.
Private land ownership plays a complex yet significant role in the preservation and maintenance of national trails. While many segments of national trails already cross privately owned land, this reality raises important questions about long-term conservation and the potential risks posed by possible bad actors. At its best, private ownership can support community-driven stewardship efforts that operate independently of shifting political administrations, fostering localized care and long-term investment in the land. However, this model also demands robust protections to ensure that conservation goals are not compromised or co-opted by those who may prioritize development or profit over preservation. So how do we ensure that conservation efforts are not being co-opted?
I think part of it is conversations. You've got to have these conversations in your local communities. There are communities that are spread all up and down our corridor and our trail corridors all across the country. And many of them pride themselves on being trail towns. And so they have signage, like Florida National Trail has this, Scenic Trail has these great signs that they do for their trail towns. It's like official and it looks the same in every town you go to. So you're on the trail. And these are private citizens that are working with their local governments to do the right thing and to be an asset to the Florida Trail. And so I think part of it is number one, you've got to raise awareness of a trail in your community. We have a trail. Okay, what can we do to protect this trail? How can we utilize it for tourism? How can we promote it locally for local recreation? How can we promote it in our schools for history? All the things. If you get a community in there behind it, then there's a lot of eyes watching. So it's harder to do the wrong thing. It's easier to do the right thing when you have a ton of people and a whole community invested in it. So I think a lot of this is about having that conversation and having the knowledge and recognition that the trail is even there and how to utilize it for the public benefit. But once you start getting these communities involved and communities on board, then protection comes naturally because the community is invested in it and the right actors are working on it. And these communities often build up great relationships with local land trusts. Local land trusts are a great way to do protection. That's their work. That's their bread and butter. And so when local communities and local land trusts are working hand in hand, then you get really excellent trail protection, and you also get really excellent utilization of the trail by both local, regional, and even out-of-state folks. Conservation has to be local. I listened to your podcast about humility and understanding things from a local level. And you can't have outside groups come into your community and tell you how to do things. That just does not work. It has to be organic. It has to come from the community. They have to care. And so that's where we have to work with and start. And so that's a lot of the work we do across the country is working with training and monitoring and understanding with local communities so that they are the ones who are out there. They're the ones who are talking to their congressmen. They're the ones who are electing their congressmen and their city council and county judges and et cetera. The protection has to start there. If all it is out of state or out of town people that care, we've lost from the get-go. Local people have to care first.
In episode 21, we discussed the importance of approaching community-centered initiatives through the lens of cultural humility. I appreciate Courtney reminding us of how we can apply these same practices when it comes to different spaces and initiatives. If you haven't tuned into episode 21, I highly encourage you to add it to your queue. The current administration has been pushing an agenda that centers privatization through corporate partnerships. Recognizing the role private entities already play in the maintenance of our public lands, I reflect on where do we draw our boundaries?
We've got lots of great options for private tourism in this country. There's all sorts of things to do, but Americans want a different experience from their public lands. They want to feel like they've left behind the world. They want to go experience history or culture. No one wants to go visit Big Bend National Park, brought to you by Sony. And I think there's a danger of a loss of authenticity when you take away people that are educated and trained to do these jobs of interpretation. Then you're always going to be wondering what bottom line is being pushed by what corporation and how authentic could that possibly be if they're not a public servant. There's a piece of authenticity and realness that comes with being a public servant. You work really hard. It's really hard to get those jobs. It's really, really hard to get an interpretive job in the Park Service. If you take that away and it's just a corporation hiring them, there's that sort of loss of realness. There is a little bit of privatization already. We have large corporations that run hotels and restaurants and gas stations in our public lands. There's some privatization that's already there. And a lot of those places tend to work with the nonprofits and the local community to provide good experience. A lot of them are very proud of the work that they do in public lands. So there is room for some privatization, but there are just some things that can't be privatized, like interpretation, like that visitor experience, like rangers, things like that. That's got to stay within the public domain. That's got to stay a public service.
So where do we go from here? How can we as a community get engaged? What are overlooked ways for people to directly impact conservation policy?
People often forget how important local government is. And so I really want to emphasize that in this time, right now, when so much is happening at the federal level, don't lose the fact that you can make a huge difference locally. You can join a bond committee and determine that your next city or county's next bond is to buy parkland. Like there's things that you can do. You can join city committees that make decisions about funding for things like this. You can push to have your metropolitan planning organization add trails to their official plans. The city of San Antonio has done an amazing job of building a really vast trail network that's going to someday interconnect the entire city. It's one of the largest cities of the country, and it's just going to be snaked through with trails. That's almost all been done locally, through local efforts. And so I just don't want people to feel like they've called their congressman, they've written, they get nothing back, and feel like that nothing that they do matters. There are tons of decisions that are made on the local level every day that can make a trail better and that can protect parkland. You can be the person that leads the charge to make your town a trail town, right? You can be the one that rallies local businesses to get behind that. You can be somebody who helps the city decide to buy land for a park. So let's not forget that local matters. Local is just as important as national.
I want to thank Courtney for joining me in conversation. The future of our national trails depends on more than just federal agencies. It relies on all of us. While budget cuts and policy shifts pose real threats, the continued care and protection of these trails also comes from local communities, volunteers, nonprofits, and everyday people who believe in the value of public lands. Whether it's supporting local trail organizations or holding policymakers accountable, there's a role for each of us in protecting these spaces.
My vision is a thriving trail system that's enjoyed by everyone from long-distance hikers to a toddler running along with their siblings. Trails connect all of us, and they're the veins of the country. They go from urban to rural. They go from the plains to cities. They go over mountains. They go by beautiful lakesides. And then they go through a lot of our most important history, like the Trail of Tears and the Settlement of Montgomery. They're really important to who we are as a nation. What we need to do is step up funding, not reduce it. We need to do proper inventory and monitoring of these systems. We need to really work on monitoring these trail corridors and protecting them. We need to step up the funding, and we need to support those partners who are doing 70% of the work. Let them do their job. They're trained, they're experienced, they've been doing this for decades. Let them do it. We all have to step up and say, this is something that we care about.
I'm grateful to Courtney for highlighting that this work is also an economic imperative, especially in a moment when policy decisions are being increasingly shaped by narratives of growth and security. Framing conservation as a smart economic strategy helps broaden the coalition of people who care about these places and understand their value. As we navigate an increasingly uncertain political and environmental landscape, now is the time to stay informed, speak out, and actively protect the public lands and trails system. With that, I want to thank all of you for tuning in. This podcast is entirely listener-supported. I truly hope you consider contributing to it by visiting artofcitizenry.com/support. Please remember to subscribe to Art of Citizenry wherever you listen to podcasts and give it 5 stars. Thank you to our producer, Ali Honore, and editor, Noah Kowalski.